better for them to be comfortable, you know? So is this a clicker that advances? Yeah, I'll just do my introduction. It's fine. No, I won't waste time. It's fine. Most people know me. It's fine. I'll say who I am. Ready? Hey, everybody. We're going to do it. I am Ben Weinstein. I'm from the University of Florida. I'm a research scientist, and my background is in ecology, but for the last probably 10 years, I've worked more on the data science and machine learning side, and so I kind of straddle those two pieces. I'm going to talk a little bit about individual ecology from above and where we are for airborne, remote sensing, and machine learning for ecological monitoring. I am happy to be interrupted at any point in time. Just shout out questions. I try to keep the talks pretty short. We'll see how fast I actually speak. If you have technical deep questions, I'm happy to answer them probably some other time, but I'll show you papers and that kind of stuff. I try to keep the talk less technical, but I'm happy to go into detail if this audience wants, about architectures, about training regimes, about other pieces. So the challenge I'm going to talk about today, I work on trees and birds, but I think we're going to talk about trees today. As I said, I think we're going to talk about trees today. And we're going to try to predict the location and metadata associated with individual trees from an airborne perspective. So this might be drones, this might be satellite, this might be piloted aircraft. And we're going to be pretty general right now about the kinds of data we're interested in. I will show examples from species prediction, but the same kind of things we're doing with traits, with biomass, with all sorts of different parts of the sort of ecosystem of trees. I don't like talks that are like magic shows where you're waiting for the reveal. I just tell you what I'm going to tell you, and then if you're not interested, usually you could do something else. So this is what you're going to learn or not. But there's no reveal here. There's no rabbit to this talk. I hope to convince you that machine learning can generate reasonable predictions of individual crowns using a combination of high-resolution sensors. We're going to be talking most about optical data today, as well as hyperspectral data. Some LiDAR, but not too much LiDAR today. That generalization across space and time will require supervision with clever ways to find synthetic labels, echoing a lot of the talks and the general talk we heard earlier. And that scaling to coarser resolutions for near global scale monitoring will require, I would say, a radical improvement in our understanding about how these models work if we're going to, for example, count every tree on Earth. And this last little point, I'm giving a second talk after the break. And so we're going to more talk about the day-to-day stuff of making machine learning models work. And so this last point will probably be the next talk. I want to say at the top that all data you see are freely available. All models you see are freely available. My lab is aggressively open science. If you have an interesting question that you want to study with this data, please let us know. Most of it's on Zenodo to download. All of it should install. And there is more research here, and more from both the computer vision side and the ecology side, than we could ever do in a lifetime. It's amazing the number of times that we start a meeting and generate about 40 to 50 years worth of research by the end of the meeting that we'll never do. And so if you have students who are interested in this stuff, we have data sets. If you are an ecologist interested in this stuff, we have data sets. Anything you want, you're welcome to have. Because the truth is there's just not enough toddlers in the world to measure all the trees. This is my little kid. I'm going to talk a little bit about a collection of papers that we've done over the last few years. This is just a portion of them. I don't like talks usually that go through a single paper in sort of great detail, so I'll be jumping around from a few different papers, but if you go to Scholar, you can find figures and sort of which paper went to which. Ultimately, what we're going to try to do today is get us towards individual tree landscape maps. So we're going to make a bounding box prediction or a polygon prediction on each tree, and then we want to associate some metadata with those predictions. So it's going to take us a long time to get there, and this has been, a very long set of research, but lots of different points to get us to this big figure here, which is a landscape map in a Florida site. I think this is 4.57 million trees. So let's start with those sort of first two ideas. I'm going to be working today at the National Ecological Observatory Network. This is my first talk in Europe. I don't know how many people know about NEON or not, but NEON is the largest airborne data collector in the United States for environmental data. These are 42 sites that are standardized for their observation data, both for terrestrial sampling as well as airborne sampling, hyperspectral data, RGB data, and LiDAR data. Neon's closing in on 5 years of airborne data and close to a petabyte. We get about 100 terabytes for every new survey, and so the data sizes we're talking about are very, very large. There's a little bit of a cheat. The LiDAR doesn't always look this good, but it's fun to show pictures that look better than there. Our first task today is we got to detect trees within an image. It should be fairly obvious that this is a difficult task because even for humans, we have a number of challenges. But if we break them into pieces, it becomes more tractable, or at least we can identify where those pieces of uncertainty are. Again, there's no reveal here. We're not going to master this incredibly difficult task, but rather we're going to try to attack these different pieces and get us closer to our goal. The first should be said there's a lack of training data. When we started years ago, there wasn't 500,000 clicked on boxes of trees that we could just pull down. Nothing like that existed at the time. There's massive class variability. For right now, we're talking about one class, which is tree, and that's for the entire continental United States. And so obviously the representation of tree is going to look massively different across geographies. We have scale variation both literally in terms of the trees growing, as well as the planes don't always fly exactly at the same height. And so we have also what I would say is fuzzy definitions in 2 different capacities. One, what is a tree, is a non-trivial question. We say anything above 3 meters that looks woody is a tree, but it's not as easy as it seems. And second, literally fuzzy definitions at the borders of trees relating to individual trees and the neighboring tree next to it. So we've got sort of 2 types of fuzziness. For computer vision, these are all well-known problems, but put together, it makes for one very difficult problem. Tree detection is in no way a unique task that started with us. This is one of the canonical tasks in remote sensing. It's gone back 25, 30 years. And I would say up to, 2015, we had the traditional sort of evolution of machine learning, which was that we had handcrafted features up to 2015, right? They were brittle. They involved heuristic rules. It often involved something like this. Find the highest LiDAR point and call it the treetop. Go to as close of a point as you can find. If it's too far away and at too big of an angle, it's a new tree. Call that new tree and heuristically iterates to new trees, right? This is how machine learning worked, circa 1997. There's nothing wrong with it. It actually produces very reasonable results. But the problem is that there were just not that many parameters in the model. They were quite brittle, and you could hand tune them nicely. So it was very satisfying on test data sets of like, oh, make the distance of the tree smaller, make the top of it bigger, and you could fit it. The problem is that it didn't generalize very well, and certainly couldn't scale. I would say this is, again, a general rule. I'm assuming that no one here cares about tree detection, but rather thinking about it as general rules for ecology. What I mean to say is that you will often find historical evidence of very good science that relates to sort of handcrafted features transitioning into deeply learned features. So what we try to do is take this and learn from it while still trying to use some of the tools which have made machine learning really powerful in the last decade. What we decided on was a sort of multi-part workflow. It's from a couple years ago now. And so we're going to take airborne LiDAR data. LiDAR is pixel level, sorry, I shouldn't say pixel level, individual response data from airborne laser altimetry. And so the canopy height model is literally the highest return of that LiDAR point. Think of it as a raster that just tells you how high the canopy is of each cell. We're going to use one of these LiDAR tree prediction algorithms that already exists. There's thousands of them. This one's in an R package called LiDAR. And it's going to come up with putative tree locations based on one of these heuristic rules. We're going to extract those predicted tree locations, and then we're going to overlay them on the RGB. The good part about unsupervised algorithms is that they scale very well, right? We can do this left side of the workflow millions of times, tens of millions of times, and generate tens of millions of putative tree locations. Some of you already said what's about to happen, right? We're going to do this. We're going to overlay them on the RGB. We're going to train a deep learning model from those putative locations, right? So we're transferring across sensors now from LiDAR to RGB. And then we're going to go back in with hand annotations, literally me clicking on boxes. I want to say you are never too good to do your own annotation. I think it's an important skill. And so you can overlay this on hand annotations, and then retrain the model for our final prediction. I'll show this in different pieces, but this, again, is not novel in any way. This is generally considered weak supervision or self-supervision before large models took that word from us. And so the definitions are a little funny here, but we'll call it weak supervision for right now. So the key aspect here is that we're transferring domains and we're doing it at scale. When you're doing projects, think about how can I use auxiliary pieces of data for my question, and then how can I scale it up? Those are two good strategies. Why might this work, by the way, is think about how neural networks are structured. They're hierarchical. It's a little overstated because that metaphor about like how human brains work, but like it's a good enough metaphor. Think about them as sort of sets of hierarchical layers where the bottoms learn general features, the top layers above that learn sort of more refined features. And the way I like to think about this is like this. I have a 7-year-old kid who's learning to read. You don't like hand a 7-year-old kid Shakespeare and be like, good luck, right? You teach them words, you teach them sentences, you teach them paragraphs, and they build up a knowledge base. I think about the neural networks in the same way. When I see people take an ImageNet pre-trained neural network and hand it annotations which cost $40,000 to get, that all I see is 7-year-olds in Shakespeare, right? You took a network who knew where like red was, and you're like, where is the beak of this bird? Like that's an incredibly difficult transition from things it knows something about to things it knows nothing about. And so instead, I think of weak supervision as a bridge, as a curriculum towards knowledge that I might have. This was a few years ago now. We generally didn't know if it was going to work. One of the fun parts of machine learning is that we lack theory, and so we just try stuff until it works. So this is the performance of the unsupervised algorithm we used, so it's pretty bad, but it generates putative locations. This at left-hand side, we're going to do this for, I think the first paper was 17 million putative locations. They look kind of like this. Remember, this is in the LiDAR and draped on RGB, so it has no spectral information, for example, so that rock is a tree because it's vertical. And you'll see things that kind of look like trees, and sometimes they're more than one tree. Yes, you could parameterize this better, but I promise you there's no global parameterization for all trees. Every time you change one knob, you get one thing looks better, you change another knob, another thing looks better. Here's the deeply learned, I call this self-supervised, I shouldn't call it that anymore. Here's the deeply learned RGB representation of those putative locations. This is kind of interesting, and again, not novel, we've seen this in other places, but we have this bump in domain transfer plus scale that allows us to learn the base features. We then add in the hand annotations. I think it was 25,000 boxes that I clicked on. And that allowed us to go from this black line to this red line. And what was interesting about this from a computer vision perspective that we struggled with a little bit was like, think of the momentum behind it. It's not a great metaphor, but it sort of makes sense. This black line took millions of samples to create. This red line, 25,000. Were 25,000 data points going to be able to move a model that was trained on 17 million? We weren't sure, and we were very pleased to find that we did get some benefit. The way this looks when you look at individual examples is here's the performance of an unsupervised algorithm for a particular site. We can look at the pre-training algorithm, and you can see sort of the ghost of the over-prediction in the bottom right. And then we have the full model, which has been fine-tuned based on our hand annotations. What's an interesting side product of this is if you look closely, the model becomes more, not only better, but more confident. We still have problems, and as many of you in computer vision know, with massive overconfidence in the model. It's highly biased, and it thinks a lot of itself. It is an ongoing challenge that if there's computer vision people in the room, I'm happy to discuss further. But the model becomes, with self-supervision or the weak supervision, the model becomes ever more confident about itself. I really want to stress to you, again, not because you care about trees, but you care about how this is going to work for your system. Trying to take your predictions and then take them back into the field and make new predictions and assess them on new sets of data to understand how that generalization works. So we naturally went back with iPads and stood in the forest and stared up at crowns and tried to draw them from underneath and try to figure out how many correctly identified crowns we could have. We're at, I would say, 72% accuracy. I differ from other talks and other people in the sense that I don't care about accuracy statistics the way other people do because I know that they're so limited in their representation. So I'm not even interested in what the decimal precision is after 72, right? And I think if everyone could feel that way, you would feel less pressured, one, to publish statistics that are highly precise, And two, you would feel less tied to what you think the evaluation accuracy of is. I tell people that DeepForest, which is the tool that we're going to wrap here, is like 72% accuracy, and no one can push me farther than that. Uh-oh. Okay, good. All right, so we wrap this into a tool that is pip install and is online for people to put the RGB data in and get tree count predictions back. We had a little thing, which was I thought I made a tool to make predictions at neon sites, so specific to neon, tree prediction. Something kind of happened wherein the community took it and did stuff with it that we weren't expecting. So DeepForest, which is what we named this tool, has taken on a life of its own in a way that's both great. It's got hundreds of users, thousands of downloads, tens of thousands of downloads now. People have been retraining the tree model for all sorts of things, for cows, for seals, for all sorts of stuff. It has vastly expanded beyond where we can maintain it. And so another lesson is that, yes, please absolutely make your data open source. Think about how general you can make it. Maybe you're studying birds and colors, but maybe the next person is studying jellyfish. You never know how the community is going to take your model and change it. And so if you make your model in a way that's not specific necessarily to trees, as if all of you cared about trees, but rather something that would be generalizable, you will find that the community is very creative, and sometimes it gets out of your control, and that's probably okay. The sad part is that I get nervous, right? How well does DeepForest perform? How much is it generalized for your untested cow prediction task? I don't know, but it's still an open question about how to use these tools in the community. The most natural question that most people want to know is how does this transfer across resolutions? Many people don't come with drone or piloted data, they want to come with satellite data, and you want to predict all the trees on Earth. I get this all the time about how do we just predict all the trees? People always jump to all the trees, by the way. It's very funny. Like, there was only 2 scales of trees. I was like, I did a forest. Can we do all of the trees? It's amazing the number of people who are like really interested in the 2.7 trillion trees on Earth or whatever. There's a lot of computer vision questions here that, again, if you have students you want to study, there's some really cool stuff that we could do overlaying planet data or Maxar data on the neon sites, right? We already have putative tree locations. How do we go from a model trained on 10 centimeter data to a model that would need to be trained on 60 centimeter satellite data? Should we use a bridge resolution in the middle, for example, train on 30 centimeters and then train on 60 centimeters? These kinds of curriculum tasks, again, if you are looking for your own research program, think about how you can break things down into steps for your model so you're not making it jump really far. Those weights, remember, it's million dimensional spaces. Those weights might be really far from where you need. So think about trying to break it into small tasks. We haven't explored this too much. We have a little bit of a cool model. This is from satellite, but we still don't yet know what's possible. One of the other challenges is that, again, for the larger space, is that we get scared sometimes that the computer vision questions and the feasibility questions get too intertwined. What does it mean to make an individual tree prediction in 60 centimeter data? Could we even evaluate that if it was true? How would you even know if you were telling the right prediction? So there's a technical task here, which is like we have a 10 centimeter model and a 60 centimeter model, and that is separate from the ecology task, which is like, is this a good idea? What would we learn from that? And so it's very important to try to distinguish the different types of feasibility within your study. And I think where I sit right now is, I think we could do it technically. I don't know what it would mean. So that's sort of what I mean by scaling. We've released the neon crowns as a data set for 24 sites, I don't remember, which is 104 million trees. Should you want to scroll through 104 million trees, there's a nice little server. It's fun. You will find patches that look great. You will find patches that look absolutely terrible. And so, again, when we go to prediction, you will find that things which are 72% accurate are not uniformly 72% accurate, just as Sarah said before. They're spatially and temporally constructed, and so they have spatially and temporal bias. And so you'll find parts of the model that look amazing, and then inexplicably, right next door, parts of the model look really bad. Naturally, the next step after true counts is to try to predict something about each of those crowns, which the first one reasonably is species. We're going to go from RGB data now into hyperspectral data. It's amazing to think about, and it's like one of my favorite things. So trees look more differentiated in the hyperspec than they do in visual spectrum. Think how cool it would be if you walked outside and it didn't all look green, but rather all the tree species looked massively different. It's just because we see in the visual spectrum, we think of trees as green. But it actually turns out that if you go further into the hyperspectral, there's this massive divergence in trees, and they can be differentiated. And I actually think it's like truly sad that we don't see it. I think it would be so cool to walk around and just see all the tree diversity. And so these are what the plots look like for individual tree species. You get these huge spectral bumps, and the characterization of those bumps are quite tied to the leaf chemistry, and that leaf chemistry is a good predictor of the species. We're going to be looking with ridiculously low sample sizes, and so often you'll see computer vision papers which are like, we are working on small data, and they have like 100 samples per class. People usually refer to the data sets we work on as barely supervised, which is a hilariously pejorative term. Or like, just like, it is, right? Like your thing's barely supervised. I love it. And so, all right.
Is that how people talk about your kid?
Yeah, it's barely supervised. And so the thing that's funny about this is that we have to take a little bit of the computer vision benchmarks with a grain of salt, because even things which are considered like fine-grained or low data regimes, we'll be talking about 3 to 5 samples per species for some of these species, and that starts at the long tail here. So we have a whole different set of challenges. And from a theoretical perspective, it's like, how rare of a thing should we try to predict? How important is it biologically versus the challenge we have? Again, we can break down the species classification framework into a bunch of small, difficult steps. The first is that we have to have rarity. The second is that species are going to look similar, especially co-occurring species of the same genus. We have lots of oak species that are very similar. We have massive class imbalance. So you might have guessed that the dominant tree species in a site might be 10,000 times more common than the rarest species that we're even thinking about predicting. And so again, computer vision benchmarks that are studying imbalance, like for example, iNaturalist are like 500 to 1. So we're at 2 orders of magnitude, sometimes higher than that. And so we also, I think probably the biggest problem we have is data pollution. So if you think about it, right, we have all these co-occurring boxes. The labels associated with those boxes are not all going to be the same, but they're going to overlap. And so which pixels go to which label is non-trivial. The way we get labels is, right, humans are standing at the trunks of trees. But because the trees spread out, we have this really difficult problem of co-occurring signals in local areas. It works really well when we only have one species in a little box area, but in diverse forests, we're going to get data pollution. If you're interested in studying a cool computer vision problem, self-correcting networks that identify samples that are potentially invalid and throw them out in like real live training is a fascinating area that we think is really valuable here. I won't go through the architecture too much, but just to point out 2 important parts of this. We've settled on a hierarchical multi-temporal mixture of experts, which means that we'll break down to sort of pieces. Hierarchical, meaning that we're going to group trees into like species concepts, mostly through taxonomy, right? It's the broadleaf trees, needle-leaf trees, and we're going to group them and create separate models for different types of groups. We're going to then have a model choose among the groups. This is called mixture of experts. It's a very old classical machine learning approach. Then we're also going to overlay those predictions in multiple years of data, assuming that the tree species doesn't change among years. Mostly that's true. And so we'll have maybe 5 years of data as an ensemble. Each of those pieces of ensemble are hierarchically structured. So it's a lot of models. It's very annoying to work with. And one of the things long-term we want to do is flatten this whole thing. This is our current best model, but it's not particularly awesome. What I, again, really want to emphasize is that you try to break your problem down into small pieces, identify, we call them ablation studies, identify the different pieces of them and figure out where your contributions are going to be. We have found that, for example, the multi-temporal and the hierarchical have an interplay that is nonlinear, that each on their own is not as effective as them together. I still find this somewhat mysterious, but it's something that happens. And so if you break down your problem into multiple steps, you may find that different parts of your neural network strategy actually interact in interesting ways. So we can get to some interesting results. These are not fascinating, but I think that it highlights what Sarah, I actually put them in while we were at lunch because I thought, given Sarah's talk, I wanted to point this out. So here's the rank order of training samples. So that means number 1 is the most common thing in the data set for a given site. We're going to break this down to individual neon sites. And 15 right would be the least common. So you mean commonness this way, and then we have accuracy this way. We see general patterns of commonness and rarity, but it's not guaranteed. Sometimes you have rare things that are just different than everybody else, and so they're really easy. You only need 5 samples. And one of the things I really want to highlight for you is it's very tempting to annotate all of your data thinking you know what's going to be hard and what's going to be easy for the model. I would suggest that you are often wrong. And so what we see here is that actually some of these samples some of these species only need few samples. Some of them need a lot. Some of them are really common. This is like, I don't know, 1,000 samples. We still don't know what tree this is. And so there are all sorts of dynamics happening inside of your data that you may overlook if you just went and annotated everything and then built a model. I really want to strongly suggest against that kind of paradigm. And I'll talk about that more in the next talk. This is what the results look like at multiple spatial scales. As an ecologist, there's some really interesting spatial dynamics and measuring spatial autocorrelation at different structures. So we have structures that occur at the million tree scale in terms of how they agglomerate. And then we have structures at the sort of mid-level scale that might be related to environmental gradients. And then we have very fine-grained structures at the sort of stand scale. This is what I'm talking about in terms of we don't have time to study this. If you're an ecologist, you know an ecologist who wants to study this, the data will be online. There will be millions and millions of questions that can be associated with this that we couldn't even pretend like we're going to study. And so we're just trying to make this available for as many people as possible. The other part of this I think is important to highlight is that because we know it's like 70-some% accurate in general, we don't yet have very good ways of associating that uncertainty with downstream ecological tasks. And again, if you're a statistician in the room and you want to study something interesting, how do you propagate error from these models into, for example, hierarchical Bayesian models that a person might use to study the spatial autocorrelation here is a huge area of research. And so we don't really know, we have fake ways of doing it, but we don't really know how to associate the scores that come out of neural networks and the kind of traditional ecological tools that involve hierarchical modeling. The structures are varied and interesting, and I stare at these pictures all day. I think they're really beautiful. We don't really know what's causing some of these structures. Here's very clearly an elevation gradient where you have falling off of a ridge. This is a glacier right there. So you've got tree species reacting to both elevation. I think these structures in here are water. So again, this is sort of Mars-like, if you know what I mean. We're like looking at this really high level. And inferring something about the environment based on the biodiversity patterns. I'm not qualified to really make assertions about these, so I just sort of look at them. I am an ecologist, but tree ecology is very sort of a different thing. We have structures that look highly sort of patterned, for lack of a better word, and then we have structures that look incredibly random. To my eye, is that truly Poisson? That Harvard one? That's probably pretty close to Poisson. And so what's causing the different structures at different levels, I think, is a fascinating question and something we're interested in studying further with collaborators. Another thing that's interesting is there's some sort of rank emergence from the model. Here is, again, the rank. So 1 would be the most common species at that site. And here is the percent of predictions. And these are different sites from different ecologies, right? These are grasslands, these are forests, these are wetlands. And what we're seeing is there's some general tendency, and stop me if you think this is like, I'm over-interpreting this graph, but I see a general tendency of the shape of this curve that I don't think I would have been able to guess a priori. What percentage of predictions will be the most common species in our data set is like hovering around 60% in a lot of sites. I don't know why, and it's not uniform, don't get me wrong, but I think there's something interesting to these patterns. Again, from a statistical perspective, is there something intrinsic in the model generating patterns that might create this? I don't have an argument, I don't have a hypothesis why there could be, but it's something we need to investigate further. Are there emergent structures in predictions of neural networks that would cause these kind of rank abundance shifts, that would cause them to be more alike than otherwise? I think is an interesting question. Where are we going with this? So with the species classification, right, we have 2 challenges. If we want to open source this, which ultimately always is my goal, is to make this available to as many scientists as possible, For the RGB data, that was fairly straightforward. Most optical cameras are structured to resemble human vision, so they cover the same wavelengths and more or less the same white balance, because they're trying to make it seem like the way you see. We're not restricted to that in hyperspectral, so all the bands are different. You can have 8 bands, you can have 126 bands, they can be wide, they can be short. And so we have this crazy domain shift problem, which is that if I want to take my model and try to make a, I don't know, 100 class model for hyperspectral of all the United States for different tree species that I make open source to everyone, how do I deal with the fact that I have some bands in different coverages, some different widths? So this is an interesting computer vision question. We have data alignment questions. Could we make the data more similar? So like average bands to make them, or clip them and average them. Or manifold alignment, that means fitting 2 neural networks and then taking the features and trying to make the feature space more similar. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I just get a quick clarification?
Go get it.
Those of us who don't do hyperspectral stuff. So these are just wavelengths of light.
Wavelengths of light.
That's been chopped up into pieces.
Exactly.
Okay.
One band is just a chop a piece.
Okay.
And so think of it as numpy arrays. You've got one set of numpy arrays that's 25, and another set of numpy arrays that's 8. The model doesn't know anything about nanometers. And so you could build a model that has some physical understanding, for example.
That was wondering. Why not use wavelength?
We could. That's a reasonable, that would be a data alignment idea. And so manifold alignment is another. We're thinking about this right now. If you have colleagues who are interested in this stuff, again, the data set will be online. I'm happy to work with people. These are going to be really hard problems. This figure is from a nice paper from a couple years ago on manifold alignment, which I really like. With that, I'm going to stop here and ask for questions, and then we're going to do a break, and then I'm going to talk about sort of like what the day-to-day work for ecologists are on machine learning. If that's useful or not useful, please let me know. I've sort of structured this talk to be a follow-up from what Sarah did this morning, but I'm open to feedback. Thank you, guys.